Early Breakfast with Rosie Wright on Times Radio with Eborn, your world of payments. Find out more at eborn.co.uk.
The Pope smiling with an outstretched arm, greeting the public who's on the front page of the Times, who put him as an outsider with a mission to change the Catholic Church, sort of looking at the legacy of his life. The Daily Telegraph says one last Easter blessing and his work was done. It's quite extraordinary, really, that he mustered up the energy and had, I think, total determination to do that on Easter Sunday, to meet with people, bless babies, address the crowds in St. Peter's Square at the Vatican on Easter Sunday, when we know he was so frail. The Daily Mail says, after his final blessing on Easter Sunday, the frail Pope dies of a stroke. Now the battle for the Catholic Church's future begins. And the quote they use here is, he's returned to the house of the Father. That's what the Vatican issued at about 7:30 Italian time yesterday to tell the world that Pope Francis had passed away. We're going to be live in Rome after 5:30 to look exactly at what happens next and how Pope Francis changed the Catholic Church. But for now, let's go through the papers and some other stories in more detail. Andrew Eborn, the barrister and broadcaster, is here. Andrew, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie. Always a delight to join you.
The Guardian put it this morning as saying he was the groundbreaking head of the Catholic Church. Is that the adjective you'd use to describe Pope Francis?
Oh, absolutely. He was the people's Pope. And as beautifully put by Sergio Cordera, who's a Salesian priest from Spain, he couldn't have chosen a better day, God apparently, to choose to take him back. It's mostly, Easter is obviously the most important occasion Christians celebrate, when they celebrate that death does not have the final word. And the last Pope who passed away close to Easter was Pope John Paul II on April 2nd, 2005, just 6 days after Easter Sunday. But if you look at what he's done, he did sort of revolutionise being a Pope. His main radicalism was in his style. After being elected Pope, he wandered out without the vestments. He wore just a simple white cassock. He wore the same cross as he wore as a cardinal in Buenos Aires. He would always ask the crowd for their prayers before his blessing. He used to travel in a minibus rather than with the cardinals, rather than moving around in the posh vehicle that he had.
And he lived
and
in
also
the
where
grounds.
he lived.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think
he lived at the papal apartment, the lavish papal apartment. He queued with others in the dining hall. So he was indeed the people's Pope.
Yes, it's a very interesting piece by Fraser Nelson inside the Times today, who says at the last papal conclave, Pope Francis sort of regarded himself as a rank outsider. No Latin American had ever been made Pope. But what is really interesting is Fraser says the Pope dodged the culture wars and its successor won't have that option. What's the case being made?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. It's a lot to do with gay rights and so on and so forth. It's a lot to do with women's rights, all of the issues facing the church and the questions. And everybody's been referencing Conclave, the brilliant movie, looking at that sort of side and how you get the very traditional the parties turning around and saying we've got to have a traditional Pope, as opposed to those who are trying to change it for the culture. I do think, he had that sort of, he had wonderful phrases he said. He told the bishops and priests to smell the sheep. In other words, he was saying, look, stay close to the people that they serve. And he did change the tone of the papacy. But basically, he did sort of dodge the issues, if you like. I mean, one of his most famous statements, which Fraser mentions, if someone is gay and is searching for the Lord and has goodwill, then who am I to judge? It was seen to be radical, but it was bang in line with the Catholic teaching. And that's what he managed to do. He managed to straddle, if you like, the traditional side without upsetting those traditionalists, whilst also giving a nod to the future. I think it's absolutely right. I think in the future, and whoever's going to be elected next will have to maybe address these issues more head on.
Yeah, Pope Fraser Nelson says the Pope's tactic was to talk the language of major reform without enacting any.
Yes.
So some of the major questions are, what about married or female priests? How far to accept gay relationships? It's going to be a challenge for whoever takes on the role next. And let's look at some other stories away from the Pope, because we've got lots more of that to come. Of course, there was a big Supreme Court ruling at the end of last week talking about what gender really means and how it's defined. Now, there's a piece inside the Times because there were protests over the weekend, and activists who oppose the Supreme Court's judgment on the definition of a woman are guilty of wishful thinking. Now, that's what a senior member of the Equalities Watchdog has said. And Andrew, you know, for many people's eyes, the Supreme Court ruling was the end of it. but not as far as the protesters were concerned over the weekend.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I always say it's about respect for everybody in the conversation. And there's two key issues here. One is respect for people who are born a woman and basically about making sure there are safe spaces. They also talk about women's sport. And the reason for the difference is they tend to be, men tend to be stronger, which is why you have those distinctions anyway. And you've had a spate of trans women winning a lot of these sports. But of course, people who have decided that they're in the wrong body need to have respect as well, but without derogating the rights of others. And this is the point, is of course everybody's entitled to protest, but a criminal damage where you're putting graffiti on statues and so on and so forth is totally unacceptable. Generally, the Supreme Court's judgment that a woman is a woman as determined at birth was celebrated widely. It was predictable that there were going to be those who would maybe misinterpret it, if you like. It's not trying to derogate from the rights of trans and in terms of respect, but just to get clarity in terms of people who didn't know about women's spaces, about sharing toilets, for example, and so on and so forth. And I think to read that people have received death threats and misogynistic abuse since the judgment is absolutely appalling. We needed that clarity. It was a day for common sense, but as I say, respect for everybody in the conversation without derogating from other people's rights.
Yeah, very challenging. The Sunday Times reported that the campaigners, Andrew, who won the Supreme Court battle, have been inundated with death threats.
Yeah, it's absolutely appalling. And J.K. Rowling, I mean, used to have terrible things. She's been a strong spokesperson for women's rights, and let me put it that way. And basically, she's received death threats as well. It's appalling. Everybody can have an entitled to a view and so on and so forth, but be part of the conversation. I mean, just taking sports, for example, you don't hear about people who started out as women and then trans to men winning lots of these sports. You don't hear about that sort of side. So that's wrong. Making people feel unsafe because they have somebody who was born a man in a women's space has got to be wrong. And I don't know why they would be campaigning for that. Absolutely have respect, but it's respect for everybody in the conversation.
Well, we'll hear from the government a little bit later on Times Radio Breakfast, and I'm sure Stig Eborn will be asking, particularly for clarity there, as there have been protests over the weekend. It's the Education Minister, Stephen Morgan, who'll be live just after 7 o'clock. Now, Andrew, young people have been using AI. This is one of your big subjects for therapy because the waiting lists on the NHS are just too long. And we know, particularly with young people, they've been battling with mental health, that generation, particularly more so than ones previously. So if you use ChatGPT or AI therapy, there are some concerns. Counsellors are saying, look, an AI therapist could sort of fuel self-obsession. It's far safer to speak to a real person. You know, can AI really, take the role of a therapist?
Well, as you know, Rosie, I've been speaking about this for a very long time. I want to put the AI into Britain. And a survey done actually some time ago now by the University of California, San Diego, found that chatting to ChatGPT was more empathetic and more effective than chatting to your GP because it's got more time, access to more information and so on and so forth.
But that might not be lengthy therapy sessions over a period of time.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the actual statistics, the NHS data itself, they said there were 16,522 people still waiting for mental health treatment after 18 months, compared to about 2,000 people waiting for the same time for elective physical treatment. Having somebody you can talk to with access to that sort of side is very, very important. The problem with ChatGPT and others is that it's about validation. And what it does, it tends to sort of usually say something like, feel free to sit in your own emotions or remember that your feelings are valid, whereas a therapist may actually sort of guide you to seeing a slightly different perspective. So I think that it needs to be refined, but certainly as a tool and about increasing efficiency, making sure that people do have access to services they're not otherwise getting, AI should absolutely be embraced.
Yeah, but what is quite stark about this, recent NHS data showed there's over 16,000 people still waiting for mental health treatment after 18 months. So you can understand why those people are looking or seeking something else as an alternative.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about tennis. I'm terrible at tennis. I wish I was better because it does seem like a really fun way to kind of socialise.
I found somebody I could play with then.
I'm so bad. Most of the time I'm picking up the ball. However, I'm related related to a lot of tennis fans. And the problem is, in the summer, brilliant. Spring, you can play. However, there is a significant lack of indoor courts. So people often are waiting to say, oh, what's the weather going to be like before I book? And it means it's become a sort of seasonal sport. Potentially, that could change. Tell us what's going to happen.
So the LTA are basically looking for an investment of 75 million to make tennis accessible, whatever the weather. You always remember Wimbledon before they had that little roof that came over. Cliff Richard used to pop up and sing when rain stopped play. And it's exactly that, isn't it? For many people, they're concerned about the weather. It means that they can't play on certain days. So there's an average of 150 days of rainfall. And the UK has about 1,600 registered indoor tennis courts for a population of 69 million, compared to France's 9,700 courts for a population of 68 million. The reason they say for this shortfall is said to include historical underinvestment in indoor venues. So this is what they're trying to address. They're trying to say, look, hang about, let's look at this realistically. We want people to play tennis. If rain is stopping play, let's try and do something sensible about it.
Yes, so it's not necessarily going to happen, but the Lawn Tennis Association is going to present its bid to obtain funding for £75 million. That would be 40 community sports hubs across the country by 2030, and therefore that might solve the long-held complaint in tennis that there aren't enough indoor facilities to play. We'll see what happens. Final thing, Andrew, this made me feel pretty bleak, I have to say. I love flowers. If I couldn't keep them alive, I probably wouldn't keep buying them. I'm not sure I would buy a plastic alternative.
It is extraordinary what's happened. So Lego have basically got their version of plants, and they're doing phenomenal sales. Last month, the sales of a Lego daffodil, which is 13 quid, were up 103%, and sunflowers, also 13 quid, was 150%, as amateur plant parents sought an easier green option. So this is what they're sort of saying, is that they can't look after plants properly. They're all dying. So rather than risk that, what's happening is you can use these plastic versions. And if you look at the stats again, by 2021, the number of houseplant owners doubled to 23.6 million. And by 2022, half of UK households owned at least one houseplant.
But they're plants. They're not plastic.
Well, exactly. And I think people like a bit of colour in their life. But you get these artificial ones as well, where they don't need any care. It's not just the Lego ones. You can get some very realistic ones. What's interesting is membership to things like the Royal Horticultural Society, which I used to represent when I was a baby barrister, has also increased. So people want this. A lot of it came as a result of the pandemic, when people sort of locked down, and they thought, well, we'll have a plant to increase our life. But you're right. I'm with you, Rosie. I like the real thing when you can get hold of it.
Yeah, so it's great that we all like gardening more and we want plants in our homes. I'm not sure we should substitute them for plastic.
No, you're absolutely right. I think plants are the new pets. That's what they say, which is interesting. But I agree with you. I'd much rather have the real thing.
Andrew, thank you very much. Andrew Eborn, the barrister and broadcaster, going through the papers with me this morning.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.